Acá. Sí, lo mismo. Escucha.
Hola. Bueno, estamos. Bueno, buenos días, entre buenos días y buenas tardes. Bienvenidos. Quería empezar yo agradeciendo al laboratorio GlaxoViv por ayudarnos a traer al doctor Jim Demarest. Es realmente un honor tenerlo a Jim para nosotros, y él va a hablar ahora, Daniela lo va a presentar con más precisión, pero yo quería abrir el simposio para agradecer a todo el grupo de Glaxo. Está acá la doctora Rosana Felice, que es la directora médica, y la doctora Daniela Camelargio, que nos ayudó mucho para que Jim esté acá. Jim va a dar su charla y después de su charla vamos a tener un espacio para discutir algunas situaciones o casos clínicos de una manera relajada e informal. Así que, Daniela.
Perfecto. Bueno, ¿se escucha? Buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Es un placer ver caras conocidas y tan amigables. Tenemos con nosotros al doctor Jim Demarest. Es un honor para nosotros que esté acá. Él es el director de estrategia de microbiología y tengo acá la bio porque la verdad que es sorprendente e inspiradora para todos nosotros. Él es el responsable de un grupo mundial, él supervisa este grupo que está encargado de virología, inmunología, diagnósticos asociados con los estudios preclínicos y clínicos. Además, es el líder de un grupo en VIP de remisión y cura. También los invito a la siguiente presentación, a la siguiente disertación que va a ser sobre ese tema. Continúa siendo profesor asociado con varios grupos de trabajo, uno de ellos de los que va a hacer referencia en esta presentación, que es resistencia viral. Así que nuevamente les agradezco que estén con nosotros y con ustedes el doctor Jim Demarest.
Okay, muchas gracias, Isabel, for the invitation to be here with you in Buenos Aires, your lovely city. And I hear there is a football match tonight, so I will try to finish before then. But it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And during this presentation, I will look to describe to you some of the history of the integrase inhibitor class and the development of dolutegravir as a next-generation inhibitor, and show you some of the data, both from the laboratory as well as clinical trials that support the barrier to resistance that a dolutegravir-based regimen has in treating patients living with HIV. As Daniela mentioned, I head up a group within ViiV Healthcare where we do the clinical virology and immunology and diagnostics and resistance and all those things. And so it's important to think about communicating the data that we have in a way that's relevant to the clinic, because we can do all kinds of experiments in the laboratory, but the clinic is reality, and the clinic is what's most important, because that's where you're taking care of the people living with HIV. And I hope that comes through in my presentation, that the data we have supports how to use the drug for caring for your patients. So this is just a summary of where we will go in the presentation. So I first just wanted to say that sometimes we get questions on what is ViiV Healthcare, is it GSK, is it similar, is it different? So in 2009, GSK and Pfizer combined their HIV business into a new company called ViiV Healthcare. We are separate from GSK and Pfizer. but they are our parents. So we have big parents. And so we in 2009, and then in 2010, the collaboration with Shionogi Pharmaceuticals was stopped, but they joined as an owner of ViiV Healthcare. So the point I want to make with this is that, and I hope you realize this by interacting with the GSK team as well as the ViiV team like Isidoro, that collaboration it's in our DNA, and that's how we view to make new medicine, but also to take care of patients, that we want to work with you because you know best what's needed for care at your location. So if you remember back to 1996 when highly active antiretroviral therapy was introduced, there were limitations of the different drugs used in the regimen, some due to pharmacokinetics, some due to drug interactions, some due to tolerability or other factors. There were also components for the lifestyle of the patient. Sometimes the medicines were difficult to take, or they had to be taken twice daily, or with a pharmacologic booster, or other ways that made it more complicated for the patient to take the medicine in the similar way. And then we know there are also viral factors where the virus is a very smart virus and it finds ways to try to escape the drug pressure in the same way that it tries to escape the immune system pressure. It mutates, it changes to find a way to grow even though the drugs are present in the patient. So one of the things that happened, so that was 1996. Back in 1990, this is data from laboratory research where scientists at Burroughs Wellcome, before GlaxoSmithKline, before Glaxo Wellcome, scientists at Burroughs Wellcome isolated the HIV integrase protein, and they did experiments to show that the protein they isolated, it was working, it was functional. And the reason I show this is because, firstly, that was what was needed to be able to study new medicines or new drugs to stop HIV integrase, was to be able to isolate a functioning HIV integrase. So don't worry about the black spots on the gel. The point is all these bands here show that the integrase protein they isolated was working. It was doing its job. So with that, it took several years, but one of the advances came from the group at Merck, led by Dr. Daria Hazuda. And one of the advances that they found was that when you screen in the laboratory for compounds to stop integrase, you need not only the integrase enzyme, but you also need the DNA in the same experiment in order to evaluate compounds that would stop HIV integrase activity. And that led to the isolation of these compounds here, which never made it to the clinic, but these are compounds that illustrate the importance of understanding the mechanism of how the different drugs work. Because, as you see here, the compound on the left in Bay, 906, 906 is active, so the flat line is stopping the growth of the wild-type virus and stopping the growth of the virus that's resistant to the other compound in panel C. But it does not stop the virus resistant to itself. However, we also see that this compound, while it had activity against the wild-type virus, it was cross-resistant, so it couldn't inhibit virus resistant to its own drug, but also to the other drug, 906. It couldn't inhibit. So the point here is that even though the compounds are acting at the same spot, some had cross-resistance, some did not, and this is very early on in the process. And then we know the data with raltegravir or Icentris. I'm just showing you some information here from the START Merck trial. And this was with raltegravir dosed twice daily versus efavirenz as the comparator, dosed once daily. And that's the design. I'm sure you are familiar with these data. But again, the point is to illustrate from 1990 to 2007 was when really it took that long for the community of drug companies to begin to have compounds that could go to the clinic. And so Icentris, or raltegravir, was first licensed in 2007, and these are the data showing non-inferiority to an efavirenz-based regimen of ATRIPLA. So this was a major advance for the field, and congratulations to our colleagues at Merck who really pioneered that work. Oh, there we go. Okay. So then later in 2013, was the launch of elvitegravir, which was dosed in combination with a pharmacologic booster called cobicistat, and tenofovir and FTC in a single tablet regimen versus ATRIPLA, and these are data again from naive patients. And one of the things here, why did it take so long for them to get to 2013 to have the approval? Well, sometimes what happens in drug development, you get into patients and you think the pharmacologic profile will be one, but it turns out to be another. So initially they tried to dose the drug without a pharmacologic booster, but they found that they weren't able to get enough drug exposure. So they needed to use a pharmacologic booster in cobicistat to get enough drug levels there. And here you see non-inferiority of the elvitegravir regimen versus ATRIPLA in this study in treatment-naive individuals. So with our efforts at GSK prior to the formation of ViiV Healthcare, some people on my team, but people from other teams that I work with who are not, I'm not their boss, we had to decide, well, what is it that we wanted to have in an integrase inhibitor that was really add something for the patient care and not be a me too, just, okay, it's similar, it doesn't really add innovation, it doesn't help patient care. And we set a high bar for the team so that we had to have a drug with good efficacy, dosing once a day without pharmacologic booster, a good resistance profile for cross-resistance and use in patients with complicated virology profiles, but also a high barrier to resistance so that the drug would be very strong to prevent the development of resistance. That was the goal. And in the laboratory, you start out, but you never know because, again, the clinic is reality, and the clinic tells us what reality is. These are data for the PK profile from the Spring 1 trial. And so this is the demonstration in HIV-positive individuals taking dolutegravir at different doses, 10, 25, and 50 milligrams. The curve in green is the 50 milligram dose, and that's, of course, the dose that went on to phase 3 and is the dose that's indicated for patient use. And the point here I want to make is it's a good PK profile, good exposure. The inter-patient variability, there is some, that's biology, but it's not very large, so it gives a good narrow window of coverage for that. But also at 24 hours after the dose, there's 19 times the amount of drug in the plasma as you would need to inhibit virus growth. So that's an important part, that the dose and the dose frequency is sufficient without a PK booster and once daily to provide enough drug in the bloodstream and in the tissue perhaps to stop virus from growing. So one of the things we do always for compounds as they come to the clinic, before they get to the clinic, is we try to understand how do they really work and what is the resistance in the test tube so that we can know better how to study what happens in the clinical trials. So these are the 3 approved integrase strand transfer inhibitors, dolutegravir on the left, raltegravir in the middle, and elvitegravir on the right. And you'll notice a couple things about the chemistry. Now, I'm not a chemist, maybe some of you are, so you'll be more familiar with the structures and the different components. But in a simple way, the first thing is that all of these bind to metal ions or magnesium that are involved in how the compounds work in the active site of the integrase enzyme. So they all have that in common. The second component is you'll see that there's a differentiation where you have the medicinal chemistry, where the chemists start to change different parts. They keep the core part of the molecule the same, but they change other parts, and that affects the pharmacologic profile, that affects the resistance profile, and it affects the potency profile. And so you see, even though they work in the same way, they are very different chemically. And then also, when you think about it and look at it at 2-dimension, you can see that dolutegravir is a more streamlined structure than the other two components. And I'll discuss that in a moment, why that might be relevant to what we saw in the clinic. But at the time, we didn't know because we didn't have the clinical data. So this is maybe a little complicated. You don't need 3D glasses to read this. But this is a modeling illustration that has been validated by other groups as well. And just to orient you to the structure, this, the ribbon in the kind of greenish and the blue, this part, that's the integrase enzyme. This orange and the blue and the red on the side here is the end of the DNA that's about to be integrated into the host DNA. And then here, here we have the structure of dolutegravir, and here we have the structure of raltegravir. So the things to note, so here's the part where it interacts with the two magnesium ions. That's the same in both. And then you have the part where dolutegravir, because of its thinner structure, and it's also a little bit flexible. You see how it bends on each side. It can fit into the pocket more easily than what we see with raltegravir because of this big structure on the top that sticks out. It makes it harder for the compound to stay bound to the enzyme. The way that we try to explain it, or it was explained to me by the chemist who did this work, is it's kind of like if you wear a shirt that's a normal, it's the right size for you, it's comfortable, you can wear it all day, there's no problem. However, if you try to wear a shirt or a dress that's 2 sizes too small, it's very tight and very uncomfortable. You might be able to wear it, but it's very uncomfortable and you don't want to stay there too long. It's the same idea where when the virus mutates to change the structure of the integrase enzyme pocket, it creates an uncomfortable or too tight. The chemistry forces are too strong for raltegravir, whereas dolutegravir has more capability to stay, and when the change in the structure makes it more difficult to stay there, so it stays there longer. Well, why does that matter? What are some of the data that would be with that? Now, these are data from the test tube that we had before we had the clinical data. And this shows that when you evaluate a normal integrase enzyme and you do an experiment and say, well, how long can the different inhibitors bind to the enzyme and stay? What you see here is that elvategravir comes off quite rapidly with a half-life of 2.7 hours. Raltegravir comes off with a half-life of 8.8 hours. But dolutegravir remains bound to the integrase enzyme in the laboratory experiment for a half-life of 71 hours. So it stays bound very long. Now, we have never measured this in a patient sample, but we do these experiments in a way that helps us understand what the potential is for the clinical relevance. And so the other thing to think about here is that when you think about a barrier to resistance, one part is the pharmacokinetic barrier, getting enough drug on board. Remember, 19 times drug exposure. Another component is how the compound acts with the target. In this case, we're speaking of integrase. So in this case, dolutegravir can remain bound and inhibit integrase much longer. And then a third component is, what does the virus have to do to develop resistance? And so that's what we start to do other experiments that way. And these are data from a study where the same, what we call passage work, was performed, where you grow the virus with different amounts of drug in the laboratory to see what will the virus do, how quickly will the virus change, and how relevant is it to what you see in the clinic. And what you see here for the raltegravir and elvitegravir columns in the center and on the right is that within 84 days or 56 days, you see lots of changes happening in the virus. The virus is mutating, again, trying to make the pocket more difficult for the drug to stay bound. And the mutations noted in red are those mutations that did show up in the clinic. Those are classic what you would recognize from your patient care. Those are mutations that are seen in the clinic that affect the resistance to raltegravir or elvitegravir. On the left, what you see is the data from dolutegravir at 56 days through 112 days. And the only thing that we see here is one change at a position 153. And this change does not confer or make the virus highly resistant to dolutegravir. So, and we really haven't seen this in the clinic either. So it is an in vitro finding, but the relevance in the clinic is not very clear. The other point I would point out is that what we call the fold change in IC50, that's really how much drug do you need to inhibit the resistant virus versus how much drug do you need to inhibit the wild-type virus. And what you see for raltegravir and elvitegravir, you can see high level up to over several hundred times the amount of drug is needed to stop the resistant virus, whereas with dolutegravir, you can go up to maybe 3- or 4-fold, but that's still within the level of coverage that we have with the dosing that we have with dolutegravir. And that's what we've observed in the Viking studies, which I won't be describing those data today. But the good thing was that what we see here in the test tube, in the clinic, it's also similar to what we found in the clinic. And I'll show you some of those data in a moment. Another experiment you can do in the laboratory is you can test different mutations that you make that are relevant to the clinic, and also some that aren't relevant to the clinic but might be interesting scientifically. This is one set of data where one change was made from a wild-type virus, a laboratory strain. One change was made at these different positions, as you see, and we tried to see what is the effect on the susceptibility of the virus to these changes. And what you see generally is that with dolutegravir, there's very little impact. There's a 151L that goes a little over 3-fold. But we also know now from the same assay that this is not really a level that impacts clinical response as well. But what you start to see with raltegravir and elvitegravir is starting to see increasing numbers, and meaning that much more and more drug is required to inhibit the virus with these mutations. Then when you look at double or triple mutants or even quadruple mutants, you see lots of red, meaning high level fold change values versus lower levels for dolutegravir. But there are some cases here, as you see, with the 138K, 148K, where it's 19-fold. And as you would know from our studies, that it turns out this pathway is a pathway that is a challenge for dolutegravir, where you're using twice-a-day dolutegravir. The response rate is lower. People still do respond, but the relative response rate is lower than other mutational pathways that are observed. So the point here is that, again, as we tried to evaluate the compound, it showed that it had a very different resistance profile, both from the ability of the virus to develop resistance, as well as the activity of the drug against viruses resistant to other integrase inhibitors. And so when we think about combining together the data with the binding and the activity, what we see here, the first slide I showed you with the 71 hours was wild-type integrase, so normal integrase. Here, these are data with, so this none would be the wild-type before. There's 71, 8, and 3. And then these are the different mutations that are seen with failure to raltegravir pathways. And what you see is that it does affect the ability of the integrase inhibitors to remain bound as you get different mutations in place, because again, it's affecting the chemistry, pressure in the active site of the enzyme, so the compound has a harder time to stay there. What you also see is that dolutegravir, although it does drop off, it's still actually as long in many cases on the resistant variants as it is to wild type for raltegravir or elvitegravir. Now again, we haven't measured this in patients, but this is consistent with the data we have from our clinical trials for the activity of dolutegravir in patients with these mutations. And the other component is when we compare the half-life of binding, so the longer you stay bound to the enzyme on the bottom, the further you go to the right. And then the amount of drug needed to inhibit the different variants with resistance. So the point is, the longer you stay bound to the enzyme, the less drug, the less fold change value you need to inhibit the different viruses with resistance. And as you see, most of the dots for dolutegravir are out here because of its half-life for binding to the enzyme, whereas shorter half-life, it takes much more drug to inhibit, and often those are levels that can't be achieved in human plasma. Now, from the clinical data, these are mutations that were observed, and these are from the Stanford database. I know that some of your laboratories here in Argentina use the Stanford database to interpret the resistance sequence analysis. And these data describe the version for the integrase class, and just showing that the ones in orange have high-level resistance, the ones in blue have reduced susceptibility, and then the ones in red, they have some activity only when they're in combination with other mutations. And so what you see here, again, is a very different profile for dolutegravir, where 148 is a significant mutation for resistance to dolutegravir, but the other ones like 92, 138, 155, et cetera, those are important for raltegravir or elvitegravir, but not for dolutegravir. So what about our data from the studies? I do have to say it does make me feel kind of proud that for the breadth of analyses that we did in very diverse patient types for our development program, treatment naive, treatment experienced but integrase naive, integrase experienced and resistant, switching, et cetera. We really had a broad program because we want to really understand how does the compound work for patient care. And this summarizes the initial studies of the filing for dolutegravir in treatment-naive patients, the single, the Flamingo, the Spring 2 study. And here we have superiority of dolutegravir to Atripla, superiority of dolutegravir to boosted darunavir, non-inferiority to raltegravir. And then in treatment-experienced patients who are failing a current regimen but are integrase naive, what we call the sailing study, dolutegravir was superior to raltegravir. And then in the Viking 3 study, there was no comparator because this is a very unique subset of patients. There was only 183 patients included, but the activity was good there with dolutegravir twice a day. And then more recently, we have data from the ARIA study, which is a study in women with Triumec versus atazanavir, and Triumec was superior to boosted atazanavir in the ARIA study. So it's yet another example of superior efficacy based upon the analysis performed in the clinical studies. So just in summary, this is a snapshot view, although snapshot, maybe it doesn't translate, but snapshot, no pun intended with the FDA snapshot, if you understand that. But this is a snapshot of the efficacy results from the different studies showing data out through week 144 in single versus atripla, through 96 weeks in spring 2 versus raltegravir, versus boosted darunavir and flamingo, and versus atazanavir week 48 in the ARIA study. So that this is an impressive result that obviously led to the indication for use of the drugs. In terms of adverse events leading to discontinuation, you can see here the rates here are they're lower in single, they're similar in spring 2 with raltegravir, they're similar numerically lower versus darunavir, and the same thing with the boosted PI in ARIA. So these are things suggesting that adverse event withdrawals is not a large component of the efficacy results that we've seen in the studies as well, because sometimes that could affect the outcome of studies. So what about the virus? What happened? What did the virus do, or what did the virus not do in people who were failing these different regimens? Now, this table summarizes the data from the 4 studies in treatment-naive individuals. So dolutegravir and the comparator arm in each case across. And the subjects with protocol-defined virologic failure. Now, this is not viral load greater than 50 by snapshot. This is when a patient has a confirmed virus above either 50 copies or 200 copies, depending on the study design. And this is when it's confirmed where they're above 50. Our virology team, they interact with the clinical lead and with the investigator to have the patient come back within a period of time and do another analysis to see if the viral load is still high or if it's back below 50 in that case. We send all samples, regardless of viral load, to get evaluated for resistance. I know that not every group does that, but that's what we do. And what you'll see here is that we sent all, for example, in spring 2, 22 samples and 29 samples. We got results back on 10 and 19 for integrase and 14 and 20 for RT and protease. So why did we not get a result on all the samples? In part because some of the viral loads at failure are quite low, and the lower you get, below 500 copies in a failure sample, although you can get results, it's often it's possible that you won't get a result because of the amount of virus there. So that's part of it. And also integrase is a different assay than RT protease, as you know. But what you see here is a consistent theme across the various studies where there's no resistance to either dolutegravir or the 2 nucleoside inhibitors used in the study, whether it's Kyvexa or Truvada, it doesn't matter. There's no resistance to either dolutegravir or the nukes. However, there is resistance detected to raltegravir, as well as to the nukes and the associated with raltegravir use. There is resistance to efavirenz as well as the nuke background with a K65. There's no resistance in the flamingo study because, again, it's not uncommon, as you would, again, know from your patient care, failure with a boosted protease inhibitor. It's not uncommon to have no resistance detected for the PI or the nukes, as we've seen with dolutegravir with integrase or the nukes. Then one of the things that was important, we thought, to analyze the data further, because people say, oh, well, but maybe the viral load was still going up and you didn't find it or something. Well, one of the things we found is actually when we looked across the studies, the viral load actually was going down at the confirmatory visit. So the visit that we tested the resistance had the highest viral load at the time of failure. So that was one component. And the other component is that the time between failure and confirmation visit, although we like to have the patients come within 2 to 4 weeks, you can see a range here, and this is true across different studies, not only in our programs, but in others, where sometimes it's 12 or 18, 13 weeks, 8 weeks, 5 weeks. So a lot can happen in the life of the patient or the life of the virus in that much time period. So it makes it a little bit complicated in interpreting what's happening when you're evaluating later. But again, what you see is generally the viral load is going down from the failure visit to the confirmatory visit. The viral load is, and it's happening in both the dolutegravir arm and the comparator arm. So there's nothing, no magic behind the mirror going on here in that regard. I won't really spend much time on this, just to say that the patients failing, they had different viral loads levels from less than 100 to several thousands, and the resistance results, again, are analyzed the same way for both arms. And that's summarized elsewhere. Just in the interest of time, we can share the slides if people need those for later. So what about patients who are switching their therapy for different reasons? So this is what we call the striving study. This was a phase 3 study of Triumec for 48 weeks. And what could happen is the patients could switch immediately, or they would switch after 24 weeks. So we wanted to see the immediate effect. The other important thing to keep in mind in this switch study is that we're switching 3 drugs, not switching 1 drug. Many switch studies, it's the third agent that's switched for another third agent, but everything else is the same. In this case, we're actually switching all 3 drugs for 3 new drugs. And that gets into things, as you would know, things about tolerability, or all of a sudden someone they feel a little nausea. What is it? Is it due to the drugs? Is it just time? So that comes into play when we look at some of the results in that regard. But in the striving study, what we did see here, again, is non-inferiority in this regard. So virologic success, either in the intent to treat or in the per protocol analysis, you see upwards of high 80s to low 90% response. And if you continued on your regimen and then switched later, it was no difference than if you stayed on Triumec, if you made the switch early to Triumec, suggesting that switching 3 drugs did not have an impact on the ability to maintain virus suppression in these analyses. And again, we think that's part of the overall barrier to resistance. You'll notice at week 48, when all the subjects had already switched, there's no virologic failures observed. There were a few subjects that had 1 time point at these very low viral loads, but then they were subsequently less than 50 copies. So no failure in this study was observed. And then in the sailing study, again, these are patients who are treatment experienced, failing a current regimen, but who have never taken integrase. And here we have dolutegravir once daily versus raltegravir twice daily with an investigator-selected background regimen. So that's important to highlight. It wasn't something we mandated. It was deferred to the investigator based on the treatment history of the patient. And what we saw here, again, as was mentioned earlier, was superiority with dolutegravir versus raltegravir, both in terms of efficacy, but also in the development of resistance that was also statistically superior in favor of dolutegravir. And what we saw of these 21 subjects at week 48 that met failure criteria for dolutegravir, 4 out of 17 had a detection of a change in the integrase enzyme. Of the 45 on raltegravir, 16 of 38 had a change in the integrase enzyme. And what we've seen in the dolutegravir patients, for example, it was also in the raltegravir arm, there was a subject in each who had to have had previous integrase experience, because at baseline, the dolutegravir patient, for example, had a 138 and a 97 mutation already at baseline. And so, as you would know, they would be indicated for twice daily dolutegravir if that information was known, not once daily. But what we see there is some changes happening here in a very complicated patient population. And what about the activity of the drugs and the virologic failure rate? So, for example, one question is, well, what was the contribution of the other components in the background therapy? And is that why you saw the results with dolutegravir? Well, What we saw was there were 32 subjects who took only NRTIs as their background. Now, it's only 32 subjects, but it's what data we have. No subjects of the 32, whether the nukes were fully active or partially active, had virologic failure. 7 out of 32 with raltegravir had failure, and again, they had mutations in RT as well as in integrase in the one case. 300 subjects roughly were on protease-containing regimens, 18 failure for dolutegravir arm, 36 for raltegravir. And then with other background regimens, that would be like Maraviroc or T20 or things like that, you can see the numbers there. So again, you're seeing a difference in the activity there. And also to note that when you look at the data relative to the PI usage, there's also lopinavir use, there's atazanavir, so it's not just darunavir. So darunavir doesn't explain the results. Now, this is a question that we get often about activity of dolutegravir in regimens where it's treating people who have a 184V virus. Now, these are the only data we had in sailing. I'll mention in a little bit the data that we just got from the Dawning study. But we had 13 subjects who had 184V who also received 3TC or FTC plus a second NRTI. 13 in dolutegravir, 12 in raltegravir. There were no failures in the dolutegravir arm, and there were 4 out of 12 in the raltegravir arm. So again, this is a consistent story. It looks to see that something about dolutegravir's activity in a dolutegravir-based regimen not only protects integrase, but it somehow has an impact on what is given with dolutegravir. So that's an interesting observation that we've seen from these data. A couple of cases just to mention to you. Because I think it highlights what the virus has to do, or the situation for the virus to begin to change and evolve in the presence of dolutegravir. This is a patient that was taking tenofovir, FTC, and dolutegravir with an active score of 2. You can see the drug concentration at week 4 and week 24, and then at week 48, 0.03 micrograms per milliliter. Now, this is positive in terms of it's detectable, but it is on the low side. And that's at week 48, which is right here in the middle of the less than 50 area. But something's happening later on, and then virus rapidly emerges. But the viral load is 622 copies versus about 800 at 700 at baseline. The confirmatory visit was 1,000. And then the viral load's going back down without any change to 386. Maybe it's due to adherence. That's what the suggestion is, but we don't know that for sure. But what we do know is that the individual developed a 263K mutation plus 2 other mutations, and that was also seen at the confirmatory visit. But it has a low level, at least relative to high changes with other compounds in terms of the fold change. And actually this clinical result here, the 3.82 would, by the Monogram Biosciences assay, which was performed, that would still be characterized as susceptible to dolutegravir for twice daily use. And then for the confirmatory visit, it would be in reduced susceptibility for use there. So something's happening here related to adherence. We've seen this in the handful of other cases, either low drug exposure for some PK interaction or otherwise, or adherence seems to be a factor associated in that way. And the only thing I wanted to highlight here was that when we did a few clones to try to evaluate what was going on, one of the things we saw was a change from week 120 to week 132. And the point I want to just make here is that this 230G and 230R, those are 2 different changes the virus has to make in order to have those mutations. So it's not, it could go one or the other. It has to do the first, and then it has to do the second. So the point is, even with the 263K mutation, which may have some fitness impact, if your drug exposure is not good, there could still be some further evolution. Now, we've known that in some ways, although it maybe not for exposure, but we know from the raltegravir studies that if a patient's failing raltegravir and they stay on the failing regimen, more and more and more and more mutations will be accumulated with high levels of phenotypic resistance occurring. And then this is another case here where you see the drug exposure was within the normal range, but then we have the emergence of a 155 and a 97 variant at protocol-defined virologic failure out at week 60. We do know in this case from the investigator report that there was non-adherence in this instance, which again speaks to the pressure it has to put on the drug in order to develop resistance in these kind of patients. And then on the home stretch here, so for the Dawning study, I'm not sure how many of you may have been able to attend the IAS conference in Paris this summer, but these are data that I mentioned earlier where this is a larger phase 3B study where it's powered to evaluate. Basically, think of a WHO regimen where we're changing to dolutegravir plus 2 nucleosides versus Kaletra boosted lopinavir plus 2 nucleosides. And so the study was designed there with these different criteria that you see here with stratification based upon baseline viral load, resistance profile, et cetera. And we had a data safety monitoring board in place for the study, as we do with our studies, and the committee met twice, and then they were seeing a trend, and they asked for a data update, and then they recommended to ViiV to terminate the study because of a ethical dilemma with the activity for dolutegravir being strong versus the comparator with the lopinavir arm. And in fact, that's what we did in the early summer, summer for us in North America, early winter for you. We stopped the study, and then we were in the process of making those changes. Basically, the analyses are further ongoing in terms of the patient characteristics, but what we see here is the background regimen. These are the different types of nukes that were used, so fairly typical of patients in these types of settings. And then what we saw was superior efficacy in dolutegravir versus the comparator, whether you looked at the ITT or at the per protocol analysis, because the confidence intervals don't cross zero. So we are in the midst of analyzing all the data for which mutations and et cetera, and we hope to be having those data for an upcoming meeting, because as you can appreciate, we wanted to get this data out quickly. The recommendation of the Data Monitoring Committee and the International AIDS Society worked with us to be able to get those data in the public domain. And this is just to say that over time, there were some increase in the amount of subjects that met withdrawal criteria. And then the anytime here are people who were beyond week 24 because, again, we stopped the study early, and we're evaluating, all of these subjects. But when you look at it in these individuals where we have data, there's 8 subjects from dolutegravir and 24 from lopinavir. Again, no resistance in any component for dolutegravir, whereas we did see resistance to the nucleoside background in the lopinavir arm in that case. So that's the conclusion from that one. So basically, I think what we've tried to do on our journey today is to look at how does one, as an industry, develop a new class, a new mechanism? How does a company bring forward a compound? And then what are the challenges if you want to make something that really is innovative and is different and brings value to patient care? And I think our in vitro data, our laboratory data, while it's important. I think the clinic, again, tells us the reality of how the drugs perform in both naive patients, experienced patients as well as those with resistance to integrase. And we have a broad spectrum of data in all those patient populations, which I think is important to know. So in terms of these areas, for efficacy, we showed superiority in 5 clinical trials, non-inferiority in others. For dose and dose interval, it's a low dose, which allows fixed dose combinations. It's once daily, unboosted. The resistance profile, it's a unique profile not only within the class, but also we've seen that there's no resistance to dolutegravir or the background that's selected in the naive studies that have been performed to date. To date, there's more than 500,000 patient years of use of dolutegravir in the real world. And it looks so far from what we are aware of that the performance in the real world use is mirrors, it's similar to what we've seen in the clinical development program. So I think you could say that, at least with the dolutegravir team, they did a good job of trying to meet all those high objectives we set for them. So we salute them. And then that's really it. Thank you for your time. I hope it wasn't too long. But if there are questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them if I can. And thank you for your attention. Yep.
Muchas gracias, Jim. Excelente presentación, realmente. Vamos a tener un momento para discutir algunos casos breves en forma informal. Primero vamos a invitar al doctor Diego Tomás, luego vamos a mientras se van preparando, ahora va la pregunta de Claudia. Luego vamos a invitar al doctor Brunia y finalmente a Diego Cecchini para que haga el comentario. Mientras Diego Sánchez se prepara, el doctor Diego Sánchez, la doctora Claudia Bujasic quiere hacer una pregunta. Ahí estamos. ¿Vos también? Bueno, bárbaro. ¿Puede acercar el micrófono acá? Mientras acercan el micrófono, lo presento, pues estamos tratando de ganar tiempo. Lo presento a Diego. El doctor Diego Sánchez Tomás es fellow nuestro en el CEI, en el Centro del Doctor Estambulián. Así que lo invitamos a presentar ese caso. Claudia.
In which situations do you recommend double dose of dolutegravir?
That's a great question, and we do get that question a lot. So dolutegravir twice daily would be appropriate to use in patients who have a known prior use of integrase inhibitor and have been failing, as also in those who have resistance genotype or phenotype. I know that genotype is what's normally used here to integrase inhibitors. That would be where you would use the twice daily. But in the other, for the virology side, the other patient populations would be once daily. There are certain pharmacologic situations where the twice daily dose is best or appropriate to use. And that would be, for example, if it's co-administered with an inducer, such as efavirenz or others, and I don't remember which of the TB medicines. If we're rifampicin, sorry, yeah, because I'm a virology, not a clin pharm, but that would be there. So from the virus side, prior use or resistance with integrase, and from the pharmacologic side, people like Daniela can help you better.
Mi pregunta se relaciona acerca de la resistencia transmitida. Este año recibimos datos distintos, si bien fueron distintas fechas, en el CROI de 9 jurisdicciones en los Estados Unidos con 0.04% de resistencia transmitida, mientras que en la conferencia en Francia, do you get? Oh, it's not translating. You want me in English?
Yes.
Okay.
Sí,
The question is about TDR. Okay.
Sorry about
About TDR.
TDR, yeah.
And this year we have these 9 jurisdictions at CROI from the United States with 0.4% of resistance to the integrase inhibitors, while in the IS we have this report. I completely agree that the CROI was before 2014, and the France report was recent. And although there are 2 groups, they are showing about TDR. Question is, what ViV is collecting from that information, one, and second, if you have any recommendation about the genotypes in treatment-naive patients.
Okay. Let's try to address. So the first part for transmitted drug resistance, or TDR, we are like you. We are aware of maybe 1 or 2 documented cases with integrase transmitted resistance. So that's number 1. Number 2, we are working with different cohorts as well as networks where we are supporting studies to collect data on real-time surveillance of resistance monitoring because we want to see if and when it becomes a problem for the integrase class, but also for RT, protease, et cetera, that we would do that. So we do actively support both cohorts and networks that are doing those types of data because we think it's important not just for ViV, but for patient care globally to understand what's happening in that way. And then the other part was...
Your recommendation about treatment-naive, do we have to detect, and one comment about the report from France, if you want to do 2 words, about why they have that 8%, which in reality those significance, if you look, there are only 3 that primary.
Okay, sure. So one of the things with the report from France was alluded to is we have to keep in mind too that because of the activity of the compounds in integrase, sometimes mutations are detected that aren't clinically relevant, that are not associated with either a change in the amount of drug needed to inhibit it or the clinical outcome. So I think maybe it's still early, and we have to work. We work with the people, we work with Bob Schaefer for Stanford, the ANRS team for their algorithm, the Germans, the Belgians. We work with everyone, providing our data to help them with their algorithms to be better, to have better information for you. So I think that's important there. I think for testing integrase in naive individuals, obviously that's a local decision that you and others have to make. What I hear from different groups is they continue to do RT and protease, but they're not doing integrase, or they are considering adding integrase because now the next generation sequencing platforms are becoming easier to use, and so they can generate the data more easily. And so they are thinking to include there. And it may help for the first question because it may help capture what's going on, is there any change in that way. I have heard of also some places that are not doing protease because they don't use so much protease, but again, that's a local change that's happening there. So I think obviously you have to you know better than anyone your patient population and your location and what's best, for there. But I think the technology changes are coming that will make it more where it will be easier for the laboratory to generate more data in one assay. So that we'll see where that goes. Yeah.
Diego?
Bueno, traemos, ¿qué tal? Buen día a todos. Traemos ahora un caso clínico que es un paciente que, se está viendo en nuestro centro. La diapositiva. Ahora sí.
Oh, wait. Un momento.
¿Me escucha, doctor?
It's very fuzzy. It's working, but it's hard to understand.
¿Me escucha ahora?
No, you're just-
Ah, bueno. Bueno, se trata de un caso que vimos en nuestro centro, como les había dicho. De manera muy breve, se trata de un paciente de sexo masculino de 30 años de edad, residente de la ciudad de Buenos Aires. Es un hombre que tiene... es un paciente masculino de 30 años de edad, entonces, residente de esta ciudad, que de antecedentes es un hombre que tiene relaciones con hombres, sin otros factores de riesgo conocidos. Hace 2 años fue la última vez que relata haber tenido un ELISA HIV negativo. Es un paciente que era bastante consciente respecto de su estado de salud y se realizaba controles de manera habitual. En contexto de un control rutinario para el cual se dirige, después de haber tenido algunas situaciones que le preocupaban, se le solicita de nuevo un ELISA HIV de 4ª generación que resulta positivo el 24 de junio del 2015. En esa visita se le solicita entonces un recuento de CD4 que informa 388 células con un porcentual de 17% y una carga viral de 50.000 copias para 4.7 logaritmos. Al examen físico, en ese momento, lo único que se constata es leucoplasia oral vellosa y unas lesiones en la región perianal tipo verrugas. El resto del examen estaba sin particularidades. No recuerda haber tenido ningún episodio que se pudiera haber asociado a la infección aguda ni nada similar. Se le solicita un test de resistencia que arroja solamente como resultado la mutación M46L, que se asocia a bajo nivel de resistencia a nelfinavir, y se le resuelve iniciar el tratamiento antirretroviral con tenofovir y entricitabina en combinación, más atazanavir potenciado con ritonavir. Y esta es la evolución del paciente por trimestre en la línea de las X. En los primeros 6 meses experimentó una caída de la carga viral de 50.000 copias a 600 y desde la primera determinación de CD4 de 388, habíamos dicho un porcentual de 17%, comienza una subida progresiva, 300 hacia 500 en las próximas determinaciones, estabilizándose finalmente alrededor entre 700 y 800 copias. Y la carga viral a los 6 meses había sido de 600 copias, continuó disminuyendo y permaneciendo a lo largo de las próximas visitas entre 100 y 50 copias. Solamente tuvo una determinación en la que se constató una carga viral indetectable y luego las demás persistieron entre 50 y 70 copias durante todas las visitas.
Doctor Nemarens, este paciente para nosotros tiene un fallo virológico con bajo nivel de viremia, 700, 800 CD4, que los mantuvo, como dijo Diego, pero sus cargas virales están entre 20 y 200 en los últimos meses. Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿qué hacer?
So what to do is have Dr. Cassetti, no. Well, from the virus side of the equation, obviously you have prior resistance to nelfinavir. You have incomplete suppression here with a boosted protease inhibitor plus the 2 nucleosides. One theory that some people have is that sometimes for protease inhibitor, it's just because the virus that comes out is not infectious and it stays in the plasma, and sometimes, but I think this is different because it's not like a blip, it's more stable, low-level viremia. And the CD4 has increased, which is good. So it seems that if you wanted to make a change in the therapy for this individual, you would want to probably go to something that would be a different activity but still have susceptibility. So you could look at the integrase class, you could look, it would be complicated for the non-nuke class, but I think that would probably be where to go in that way if you wanted to keep as only 3 drugs instead of intensifying. Was there intensification done? No intensification. So I think that would be something to explore. You could try to, if you had another resistance test, maybe when the viral load was coming down, to see if something changed in that level. You could try a resistance test with a low level of virus, but you may not get a result, but you could try. That might inform what you would do. But it would seem that maybe changing the boosted protease inhibitor for something like an integrase inhibitor might be a good approach. Well, any integrase inhibitor. Okay. Well, I think you would obviously want to look at the patient's profile. What other medications are they taking? What's the impact? Is twice a day or is a pharmacologic booster something that is needed or a problem for the patient? Or would you go to a once a day unboosted with dolutegravir? Again, that's something you have to discuss with the patient. But based on the virology, I think the integrase class would be an option here. But for looking to which integrase inhibitor, you have to make that decision as the treating physician, and you would factor in all of the pharmacology, the barrier to resistance. Do you want to have a lower chance of failure later? I think that's an important component, and you've seen the data today. But you have to decide what you would do for patient care in that way.
Muchas gracias. Brevemente, ¿querés comentar el caso? Gracias, Diego. Un aplauso para Diego. Ahí, desde ahí. El micrófono, ahí.
Comento el caso. Es una paciente de 38 años, trans, con diagnóstico en el 2006, sintomática, estadio C3, con menos de 100 CD4, con un test de resistencia genotípico que es sensible, demuestra un virus salvaje, sensible a los 3 grupos de antirretrovirales. Comienza tratamiento con efavirenz, tenofovir y lamivudina, con buena adherencia, siempre cargas virales no detectables. Es una paciente que comienza a desarrollar un síndrome metabólico muy florido, con una labilidad emocional importante, donde empiezan a aparecer trastornos neurocognitivos por el efavirenz, pero que era difícil de saber si tenía que ver con su labilidad. Bueno, en consecuencia, hace 2 años, 1 año y medio, yo le ofrezco cambiar a raltegravir y mantener tenofovir y lamivudina. Eso se produce a las 8 semanas del nuevo esquema carga viral. Mantiene carga viral no detectable, doy como que es un esquema, un switch que funciona. Después de eso la paciente entra en una etapa personal en la que la pierdo en un control, y cuando vuelvo a verla es una paciente que relata una adherencia irregular. Conclusión, falla de tratamiento confirmada. Dos cargas virales con más de 1000 copias, y el test de resistencia demuestra una K65R y una M184. No está el test de integrasa porque no es de rutina, digamos, si bien lo pedí, bueno, se requiere una serie de pasos administrativos para lograr la autorización, pero ya está en marcha, ¿no?
See, so that patient is something like the Viking study patient. And in the Viking study, not every patient had documented resistance to raltegravir or alvategravir. Some had historical failure, but no test for resistance. So I think from the integrase perspective, the use of dolutegravir in this case would be twice daily for dolutegravir in this individual. And then for the nucleoside mutations, it's a little bit complicated, but I would say that, again, the Viking data and some of the data from sailing is even when the two nucleosides are compromised, the patient may still have a good outcome with twice daily dolutegravir in this case. So I think changing from raltegravir to dolutegravir with known failure is within the appropriate use, as we saw with Viking, even if you don't have a test for the resistance.
ACT was the only one that still remains sensitive. ACT.
AZT, yes. Right. So again, that would be something if you, it would up to you how you want to change, but maybe if you change one and then go from there. But I think, again, as you said, you have to factor in the patient's situation, what's important to them, what impact do the medicines have on their physical appearance or their metabolic syndrome, as you said. So I think I can see how that would be a challenging case. From the virus side, as we say,
The patient.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, doctor de Marés. Creo que disfrutamos mucho el simposio. Un aplauso para el doctor. No se vayan porque la mesa siguiente es de comunicación que va a estar muy linda. Así que gracias a todos. Diego.